Welcome back to the MEIR dialogue. My name is Zaki, and today we are joined by Shabnam Karim, partner and head of Middle East Insurance at Norton Rose Fulbright. Hi, Shabnam. Nice to have you here.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me.
No worries. Today we're here to sort of discuss the far-reaching long-term impact of the current conflict in the Middle East, the US-Iran war, and it's how it affects the regional and global reinsurance industry. The ongoing hostilities have created a very complex risk environment with insurers, reinsurers, brokers, and policyholders grappling with issues around coverage, claims, and even regulatory challenges. So, Shabnam, can you give us like an overview of the type of claims activity that Northern Rose Fulbright will expect to see as a result of this current conflict?
The current conflict in the region is really generating quite a broad claims landscape. And I think it's more than any sort of market participant had initially sort of anticipated. The first area that people think about in a conflict situation, obviously not just connected with the Middle East conflict, but in historic conflicts, is the lines of policies that relate to political violence and political risk and war and terrorism. And that's often the
Yeah.
first product where people think there are going to be sort of claims that are notified. But in fact, what we have seen and are continuing to see and expect to see more of is that we expect there to be a higher volume of claims relating to, of course, marine related
Hmm.
issues because of the disruption to cargo and shipping routes.
Yes.
But in addition to marine related issues, we expect that there will be a number of claims relating to other transport sectors like aviation, which have been affected,
Yeah. Of course.
and also the energy business, which is, of course, critical specifically to the Middle East, and some of the both physical impacts and the business related impacts that have arisen for that sector in the Gulf in particular.
Hmm.
Now, some of the areas that we have seen issues in are, of course, marine and shipping, quite
Right.
clearly so, but also supply chain disruption. So, the kind of claims that you see arising from that relate to things like trade credit related issues, where you've got
Okay.
disrupted shipments,
Okay.
payment defaults, and the inability to get sort of a receipt of your goods in a timely manner and raw receipt. So that really impacts the entire supply chain and gives rise to consequences for trade credit insurers. So that's a particular area to continue to watch as there continues to be disruption in the shipping space and in, for example, port operations. So
Right. Right.
marine supply chain disruption leading to trade credit and non-payment related issues. Another area that has been a particular hotspot,
Hmm.
particularly in the Middle East and the Gulf region in the last couple of months since the conflict arose, is a surge in cyber related activity.
Yes. Yes.
And we had already seen an increase in activity over the last 18 months specifically.
Hmm.
But particularly in the last couple of months, we've seen an increase in activity, and UAE authorities have actually announced that they've seen between 90,000 to 200,000 attacks being perpetrated, which they have successfully been defending.
Right.
So what you get is in a time of conflict, you get cyber activity relating to state-sponsored actors,
Yes.
and that's a particular area of concern. But you also get opportunistic activity.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
opportunistic activity comes when you get threat actors who are deploying malware and ransomware within organizations, because those organizations are more preoccupied with dealing with their staff, dealing with
Yeah.
keeping revenue going and businesses carrying on. And so people take advantage, and particularly sort of malicious actors take advantage of that. So we've seen an increase in both state-related activities, hacktivism, and opportunistic criminal activity connected with cyber.
Right.
And that's an area that we expect to continue to increase materially. So those are some of the areas that we're seeing issues in. One of the particular more medium term to long term effects can be when there's increased economic disruption within
Hmm. Hmm.
businesses. One of the knock-on effects of that can be an increase in financial crime and fraud related activities,
Yes.
sometimes insider threats as well as external threats. So that's something that businesses need to keep aware of and make sure they've got sort of fraud mitigation and prevention steps in place within organizations. Otherwise, we see that those insurers that deal with commercial crime policies and fraud related policies will see an increase in activity in the coming months as well.
Speaking of cyber, there are war exclusions in most policies, right? And that includes cyber as well. There's a war exclusion in cyber. So if it's a state-sponsored attack, it's not
Yeah.
covered. But if it is, like you said, you mentioned an opportunistic attack, then it should be covered. So the question is, how do businesses and how do insurers identify whether it's state-sponsored or whether it's opportunistic? Are they even able to do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, we over the last sort of, year and a half have seen a range of attacks involving a whole range of organizations,
Hmm.
from healthcare to energy to education and beyond. And one of the key aspects of understanding who the threat actors are is the forensic analysis around the
Hmm.
modus operandi of the threat actor
Right.
and the hallmarks of the attack, and whether those relate to, for example, an entity or a threat actor group that is connected with a state.
Hmm.
One of the reasons we have to look at that is when you're dealing with a ransomware attack connected with a client, whether it's an insured client or a corporate client, you may have a scenario where the client says to you, we want to pay the ransom. And so when we're
Right.
doing that assessment, we have to look into who the threat actor might be.
Yep.
Because if it is a state-sponsored attack and it relates to an organization which is connected to a country with it, which is sanctioned, for
Hmm.
example, then we'd have to give advice around the risks and the inability to make a ransom payment. So we have to do that
Okay.
anyway. In a scenario where you've got a conflict situation, it's really quite important to understand whether this is a state-sponsored attack or whether it is just opportunistic threat actor group.
Right.
Now, attribution is something that will be key to understanding the cyber insurance piece, because
Hmm.
as you say quite rightly, many policies have cyber war exclusions within
Yes.
them. Now, one of the key cases, a legal case which related to this, is the Mondelez case,
Hmm.
in which there was a question about whether the NotPetya attack was
Yes.
attributed to a state
Right.
organization and whether it should therefore be excluded for cover. That policy was a property policy, but the question there was about whether a cyber war exclusion policy was triggered.
Okay. Okay.
Now, one of the things you look at when you're assessing that is the hallmarks of the effect of the attack, but also whether there has been an acceptance by a state that, yes, we perpetrated the attack.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there are numerous arguments which insurers are currently running on notifications that have been made in this current conflict where they say, well, there is a war exclusion
Yeah.
or, an exclusion that relates to hostile acts, and therefore there is no cover. But in the coming months and weeks, that will obviously be assessed if those claims are progressed by insureds. And the key issue will be whether there is attribution to a state entity. Now, in doing
Right.
that, we'll have to look at, has there been acceptance that
Hmm.
it was a state that did this attack? And if there
Hmm.
isn't, then what is the evidence and the intelligence around who the threat actors were and the
Right.
hallmarks of that attack? But it is a very, very high hurdle for both parties to demonstrate that this is a state-sponsored
Hmm.
attack. The other key thing you have to look at, if whether you're an insured or insurer, is what the wording is of your cyber war exclusion. There
Right.
is a standard London market exclusion, which is quite broad, but those exclusions are being adapted as, companies and insurers are looking at a very complex environment in which they're dealing with cyber attacks. So if you've got broader wordings or restricted wordings, you need to look at the actual policy and the wording to look at, what you need to demonstrate to sort of get over the hurdle. But certainly the Mondelez case is one case that is a relevant case to look at what both parties argued.
Moving on slightly to war and political violence policies, in
Yeah.
general. So naturally, everybody's talking about them right now. As far as I understand it, the take-up rate for that was quite low prior to this whole conflict happening because the entire region had been so peaceful for so long. But right now, what are the possible coverage issues coming up due to this conflict underneath, political violence and terrorism policies within the region?
Political violence and terrorism policies, they vary sort of considerably in scope.
Hmm.
Some policies respond to specific named perils,
Hmm.
so war, insurrection, terrorism,
Yep.
etc. And there are others that are quite broad and they cover all sort of risks of political violence. It's necessary to look at the definitions within policies and how those perils are defined and whether you come within scope of cover will be critical to actually assessing whether coverage is triggered. In some countries in the region, historical conflicts in the region, we have seen things like whether a riot has occurred, and the
Hmm.
definition of riot is assessed by the courts,
Okay.
whether there has been civil commotion as a result of some sort of political activity or some sort of warlike operations.
Hmm.
In some wordings, you'll see cover whether war has been declared or not declared. So
Right.
that can be broader than just where there is a declaration of war. But certainly the scope of cover is something that will have to be assessed very, very carefully when you look at the actual wording. The other aspect is that there are some wordings that a business might have bought
Hmm.
where it's a very narrow territorial scope. So one country is covered, but actually they may have operations in multiple countries, and it may
Right.
be that some countries were considered more high risk, or certain kinds of activities were considered more high risk and there isn't cover for that. So
Yeah.
what you might find is that there's some aspects of loss which are within scope and then some which actually are not within scope. The third key area will be whether there is overlapping coverage. So let's say that you've got a property policy
Hmm.
which covers physical damage. And there is some buyback there for war-related activities or
Right.
conflict-related activities. But separately, you've also got some sort of political violence or standalone policy which provides cover. And in that scenario, you're going to get into an argument between insurers and insureds that there are multiple policies that respond. And so what you have to do there is an analysis around allocation
Hmm.
and whether there are clauses within each policy that say, well, we're going to come first or we're going to come, second, or whether actually they both say the other applies first, and then you have to look at allocation. So
Yeah.
there are numerous policy issues that will arise and which will be debated in coming months. You might also have a situation where you've got certain losses which are uninsured and then
Right.
certain losses which are insured. So there's a question there around crystallization of loss, assessment of loss, and looking at where there is cover and where there isn't, and quite a detailed analysis of that in terms of loss assessment as well. So all of that will develop in months to come. At the moment, you're just within the notification stage of certain policies, but there is sort of a complex assessment which we expect to see in coming months.
How well equipped are insurers who have policies within the region, PV and cyber policies within the region? How well equipped are they to respond to these issues?
I mean, what we're facing in the GCC in particular is really unprecedented.
Hmm.
It's been obviously a situation where there's been a lot of stability and, in recent years, significant economic growth and prosperity. So it is an unprecedented time for local insurers. However, the local markets here, particularly the reinsurance markets that are set up in the DIFC, they have historically covered a broad range of countries within
Hmm.
the region. And they have covered countries like certain African countries from the DIFC. They've covered other regional places like Syria and Lebanon, where there has been conflict activity in the last few years. And so they do have experience of dealing with these sorts of claims, whether it's property damage or, political violence issues, and certainly cyber-related issues in the region as well. So to that extent, there is a great deal of experience within the broader Middle East region.
Hmm.
For example, that the Arab Spring losses that occurred
Yeah.
affected obviously Egypt, and there was significant activity there and insurance coverage when it came to the DIFC reinsurers and the local insurers in the UAE as well. So great experience there. It is unprecedented what we're dealing with, but
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
we do find in this region is that we are supported, and the insurers in the UAE are supported by very experienced reinsurers
Hmm.
who may be sitting in London and sitting in Singapore and the US. And there is a great deal of experience in those markets of the policy wordings, the challenges that come with those wordings, how they're determined in certain court jurisdictions.
Right.
And there's a lot of guidance that, international providers of reinsurance and also service providers can give, because we have been dealing with conflict-related scenarios and the impact on insurance for decades. So to that extent, there is a lot of guidance that the global markets can give to the local insurers, but there is some good experience here as well. As I said, at the moment, what we're seeing is that the insurers are sort of, dealing with the initial stages of notifications.
Hmm.
But there is a period in which there may be a ripple effect with
Hmm.
broader, longer term claims activity.
Yeah.
And insurers are preparing for that at the moment. So time will tell. But yeah, good experience both in the local markets, but also specifically in the reinsurance markets that support the local market here.
You mentioned earlier some PV policies will only trigger if a war was actually declared.
Well, what we have at the moment is there are increasingly broader wordings around what the
Hmm.
trigger points are. So if you bought a policy where there was, for example, let's say it's a property policy and there was a war exclusion in it, for example, then the wording, for example, over the years has become broader to say, whether the war is declared or not declared.
Mm,
So that's a broad wording.
right.
Where you've got certain PV and war and terrorism policies, again, they will have very clearly defined trigger points,
Hmm.
and that needs to be looked at. And it also depends on what the insured has bought and what has been offered to them.
Yep.
If they work in and operate in a very high risk jurisdiction in the region, you may find that there is restrictive cover. Or
Hmm.
that there is, for example, a waiting period which says we'll cover political violence related activities, but we won't cover it for the first 48 hours. So,
Right.
again, it's very important just to look at exactly what the scope of cover was and what the triggers were.
Hmm.
There will be certain broader wordings and certain more restrictive wordings. So, that's just something to keep in mind that you've met one of the criteria for the named perils.
Hmm.
And that you come within scope of cover. But there certainly are a whole range of wordings on the market.
Well, if it comes to that kind of situation where one country has formally declared war, but the other hasn't, could there potentially be any complications in that type of, in that scenario within the wordings?
It really depends on the wording, but what we have started seeing is that often the exclusions say, for example, war whether declared or not. And it also expands the exclusion to what we call warlike operations.
Hmm.
And the reason they do that is that often countries may not say this is a war, so
Yeah.
because that has various legal consequences to it as well. And so the exclusions in the market were also broadened to say even if war has not been declared, this exclusion still triggers
Right.
if, for example, there are warlike operations. So warlike
Okay.
operations, again, there would be a fact specific assessment of whether there has been a warlike operation. But if
Hmm.
a country is providing its military and its missiles and its military sort of arsenal, you may consider that there are warlike operations, even if, for example, there hasn't been a formal declaration. So over the sort of, probably I would say since 9/11, there's been a real tightening up of the wordings around
Hmm.
war exclusions to ensure that there isn't something that's catastrophic which impacts the insurance market and it results in significant losses,
Yeah.
across the world. So often it's a broad exclusion, but
Yeah.
again, you'd have to look at the exact wording and what the client bought.
Moving on to, a lot of claims are expected to come out from various lines of business. What are the main aggregation challenges that you foresee coming up due to this conflict? And how
Yeah,
might
absolutely.
the aggregation clauses in policies and contracts be tested?
In a sort of widespread conflict, which may be prolonged, aggregation is a really critical area of consideration for insurers and insureds as well. Insureds, for them, it may be relevant because, for example, if you are a business that's had multiple physical hits, and let's say you have a policy that covers property damage or physical damage that occurs, and you're a site that's had multiple attacks, you may want to argue as an insured, again, fact dependent, you may want to argue that there's more than one occurrence or event
Yeah.
because you may have separate limits per event. On the contrary, insurers might want to argue that multiple occurrences or multiple events should be aggregated into one because
Right.
they would want just one limit of liability. This was a specific issue that came up during the World Trade Center attacks. And
Right.
there's a lot of case law, particularly in the UK and the London commercial courts, around how aggregation is treated within policies. And what we found is that there is an assessment of what the unifying factors are between each occurrence and each event.
Hmm.
And that's something that may also be relevant in this scenario, because what you might find is that you want there to be, as I said, there's a difference in approach between one party versus another. And what you would be looking at from a kind of a legal perspective is what the causative factors are and what the unifying factors are between each event or occurrence in order to assess whether it's one or whether it's multiple hits. So
Right.
the aggregation issue is important. It's more obvious when you have, because, for example, where there's something physical that occurs.
Mm-hmm.
However, another thing that insurers and insureds need to think about is that, for example, in a cyber policy, if you've got multiple attacks that occur and you've got disruption that occurs due to various attacks,
Yeah.
that's not so obviously visible physically.
Yeah.
But again, there'll need to be some assessment of whether there are unifying factors between
Mm-hmm.
each effects that occur. The question of what constitutes a single occurrence or an event for aggregation purposes, particularly where you've got sort of sustained activity
Mm-hmm.
and a campaign of hostilities which can carry on for a lengthy period of time, that can end up being quite contested between insureds and insurers.
Yes.
And there may be questions around whether separate physical strikes or separate cyber attacks or acts of disruption constitute a single occurrence or multiple occurrences.
Mm-hmm.
You need to look at what the policy wording is when it comes to
Yes.
aggregation. And they may be wording like, a single originating cause. And so you have to look at sort of causative factors, whether there's contributing causes, and then try and understand whether actually it could be one event or multiple events. And
Right.
as I was saying earlier on, one of the key cases on that was the cases that came to the UK courts after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there were cases around whether the attacks on the two towers
Mm-hmm.
constituted one event or whether they
Oh,
resulted in two
it was
events because
separate
there was an
events, right?
attack per event. And the insured parties argued that it was two events because they wanted to maximize recovery, and the
Right.
insurers argued that it should be aggregated into one. And those cases established crucial precedents for how insurance companies and courts interpret events and occurrences in sort of multifaceted catastrophes. So
Okay.
those cases are something for insurers and insureds to look at. Eventually, the courts held that in some of those reinsurance cases, that actually it was only one occurrence
Mm-hmm.
because these events were attributable directly to a series of similar causes under that specific aggregation wording. So it's the aggregation wording which is important in terms of assessing, what the factors are to look at and whether it's one event or two
Right.
events
Right.
that can be treated separately.
Are there any specific events that occurred during this conflict that you think might run into the same issue of, whether people will start arguing whether it's one event or two events? Or has there not been anything so significant as of yet?
Yeah, I mean it's hard to assess it at the moment, but of course there are businesses in the region that have been impacted
Mm.
not just once, but in multiple attempts,
Yeah.
or have been targeted specifically. And I think the other aspect of this is that, as I said, sometimes there is that visible aspect of being targeted and things like physical damage. The
Yeah.
World Trade Center case is a very obvious example of is it two or is it one? Is it
Mm-hmm.
one? But sometimes you can have triggers which are less visible.
Right.
So, for example, if there is a disruption to shipments coming in and there is a default,
Mm-hmm.
you may have multiple defaults.
Yeah.
Now, does that constitute, one occurrence under a policy? Or will it constitute one claim, or can multiple claims be aggregated? And I think that's something that is going to take time to develop.
Right.
And it's something that we need to keep an eye on. But certainly the aggregation wording in policies is going to, be reviewed and considered in months to come as the notifications come to the fore and as insurers start to assess what the actual exposure is from those notifications. So I think it's one to wait and watch.
You mentioned UK law and how the 9/11 attacks, had effects on how courts and insurers viewed aggregation losses. That's London, right? And the GCC is multiple countries with multiple governments, different views on law. And then there are jurisdiction issues, with businesses having operations in multiple countries that, would run into different issues with different courts. So how should insurers, prepare for this? What kind of issues do you see coming up because of these jurisdiction disputes?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really good question. The UAE, if we just focus on the UAE for a second, it consists of multiple legal systems and court
Mm-hmm.
systems.
Mm-hmm.
So in the UAE, you have the onshore UAE system,
Right.
which is a civil law system. And there is specific UAE insurance law, which treats things like the validity of exclusion clauses, the ability to argue late notification, the ability to avoid a policy or exclude something from cover, specifically under law subject to the UAE Commercial Code and the UAE Civil Code and some cases around that. There is no system of judicial precedent in the onshore UAE system,
Right.
but more sort of higher court decisions, like cassation court decisions,
Okay.
can be persuasive, but it's not a system of binding judicial precedent. So the
Right.
treatment of an issue happens in a very specific way in onshore UAE. By contrast, in the UAE, you have the DIFC and the
Yeah.
ADGM regimes, which are common law
Hmm.
systems. And the ADGM, for example, directly imports English law, whereas the
Okay.
DIFC legal system is a mix of DIFC laws and, where there is no answer in DIFC laws, common law,
Okay.
jurisdiction and precedent. The court systems are also very different from each other. So in the UAE context, onshore UAE, it's Arabic language
Hmm.
court systems, and there's a process of an expert being appointed by the courts
Yes.
to determine insurance disputes. And I'm talking here about, for example, in a reinsurance context,
Hmm.
if you have a direct policy, which is subject to UAE law, that would go
Yeah.
to the courts with the appointment of UAE court experts. In a context of retail insurance, there's a SANADAC process, and where you've got a direct insurance issue, it goes to SANADAC. Reinsurance will go to the onshore courts. And that's treated differently to the DIFC and the ADGM court process, which will
Right.
look at cases that have occurred in other jurisdictions as well. So, for example, in an onshore UAE court system, if there is no answer within the law,
Hmm.
then it's at the discretion of the court, with the help of a UAE court appointed expert, to consider how the law will be applied to the facts in case.
Right.
Now, sometimes they may be interested in looking at what happened in other jurisdictions, like the jurisprudence we've mentioned in other countries, like in
Yeah.
England and elsewhere, around war exclusions, but they're not bound to look at jurisdiction in any other jurisdiction, and they can assess themselves how something should be determined
Mm.
according to UAE law. So, what you will find there is that if a direct policy is subject to UAE law, you
Yes.
may have a different outcome, let's say at a reinsurance level, where the policy is subject to DIFC or English law or ADGM law. And that can then give rise to conflicts between the direct insurers and reinsurers.
Hmm.
We saw similar issues, for example, during the floods
Oh,
process,
yes. Yep.
where at the direct level, there were certain outcomes which the local insurers were bound by, and certain approaches that the local insurers took, and the reinsurers took a different approach. And
Right.
so this is also an area that reinsurers need to be aware of, that if there is a difference in governing law and jurisdiction between the different policies, there may be a difference in outcome. And that can be
Right.
mitigated by sort of agreeing if there's, the same law and jurisdiction on both policies. And there can be certain clauses that can be put into place to make sure that if a local insurer is bound, the reinsurers are
Mm.
too. But then there are reinsurers that may take the view that actually our position is, consistent with how things may be determined in other jurisdictions, like in
Right.
England and DIC and ADGM. So this may give rise to differences between the markets.
During COVID, right? Uh, Across the United States and across UK and Europe, there were many court cases about claims, and so on and so forth, because the experience, the history, the wording wasn't there. This was specifically not present in Asia because of we had SARS, and so a lot of the insurers already had pandemic scenarios prepared within their policies. As you mentioned earlier, right, in this region, lots of experience, wordings are all sort of very laid out. Everybody knows sort of what to expect and what to do. How many of these claims essentially end up in the court? Essentially, like what's the percentage?
Contrary to Asia and other jurisdictions, when claims do end up, for example, in the onshore courts, it's not a public system in the sense that you're able to get into a court
Mm.
portal and see all the cases that have been lodged relating to a
Right.
specific issue. Also, judgments are not widely publicized, although now
Okay.
increasingly in the onshore system, the Ministry of Justice does publish cases, particularly particularly those at the higher levels of the court system.
Right.
So you won't necessarily get an answer of, like in the US, there's, it's very clear there's been 50 cases that have been lodged on a specific issue.
Hmm.
That doesn't happen in this part of the world.
Okay, okay, okay.
So it's a slightly different space in that regard. I think that the experience of what happened in COVID is relevant and interesting. For example, there were untested wordings in this part of the world. For
Hmm.
example, you had claims relating to business interruption, which
Right.
were raised in the post-COVID setting.
Yep.
However, the view was taken that if there is no physical damage, then there is no BI cover
Yep.
within property policies. And so there was a great deal of assessment by the courts due to those facts. As I said before, there's no system of precedent. So what that
Yep.
means is that every judge and court system can decide the outcome depending on the facts and
Right.
in its own discretion. And so, what that does in our part of the world is that it gives rise to some uncertainty about what the outcome might be.
Right.
And as a result of that, what we saw in the last few years, and as coverage disputes have increased, is that insurers and reinsurers specifically have wanted more certainty of outcome. And what they have
Hmm.
started to do is focus on disputes being arbitrated.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that you can then select arbitrators who understand the policy wording that is being assessed.
Hmm.
And so it's now common or increasingly common for reinsurers specifically to want the dispute to be arbitrated, where they can choose a panel of three arbitrators and one will be
Right.
decided
Right.
and selected by the insurer, one by the insured, and a third is usually neutral from the centre.
Yep.
But it can be specified that the arbitrator must have X numbers of
Mm.
experience in this specific kind of policy, whether that's a cyber policy or a D&O policy, whatever it might be. And that provides some more certainty of outcome because you have then a person deciding the dispute and deciding the policy wording issue, understanding that policy wording. So
Okay.
that's something that's been done to mitigate some of the uncertainties that can arise in our part of the world.
Following up from that, do you expect there to be a lot of disputes based, stemming from this conflict?
I think it remains to be seen in terms of the stance that's taken
Hmm.
by insurers and whether they've got wordings that are very clear when it comes to exclusions.
Right.
If there are, for example, wordings in the market where certain arguments can be raised
Hmm.
about whether the exclusion is triggered or not, or whether there are issues around the validity of exclusion clauses, then it is possible that insurers will take a hard stance where they may say it's very clear there's an exclusion, whereas the insured says no, the exclusion is not valid or
Yeah.
it shouldn't be upheld. And then if you've got sort of significant values where the insured's expectations are, multi-million dollars and the insurers are arguing that there's no liability whatsoever, you'll find there's a disparity between the parties.
Hmm.
And again, depending on the governing law and jurisdiction, if it's onshore UAE, there isn't really a concept of without prejudice here.
Yeah.
So it's more difficult to resolve disputes between parties, and we do find that there's a higher percentage of claims that do end up in litigation. It remains to be seen whether, that will occur in this scenario, whether there
Hmm.
will be more commercial resolutions. But certainly when it comes to notifications and claims being intimated, we expect that to increase. And we expect there to be a longer tail to those sorts of losses and disputes arising. As I said, less so focused on physical issues and
Yeah.
strikes and damage, but more the longer term supply chain disruption, economic
Yeah.
volatility, cyber related activity as well. So those claims and notifications are there, whether they result in disputes will remain to be seen depending on what the commercial approaches of the parties and how far apart parties are as well.
So thank you very much for your very enlightening answers. I think it's a very important bit of information that insurers and reinsurers do need to pay attention to. Now, as I understand it, Norton Rose Fulbright will be having a webinar where you sort of be going through in more detail sort of what we've discussed already.
Yes, that's absolutely right. We're going to be looking at some of the claims and cases we've dealt with sort of historically and in recent years relating to political violence and risk and conflict related situations, and some of the best practice tips that we would give insurers and insureds, in documenting their claim, in insurers assessing claims and looking at some of the coverage issues that arise. So it will be a very practical session relating to previous cases where we can apply analogies to the current conflict that we're dealing with. So yeah,
Right.
stay tuned for that,
Right.
for more details of that. And thank you very much for allowing me to participate and be,
Oh, yeah.
part of the conversation today. Thank you very much for that.
Yep. Thank you very much again, Shabnam, for joining us. My name is Zaki. This has been the MEIR Dialogue, and we will see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.